I don't want to call it a peer conflict. It's not, but to, be in the same class. This should not have happened. The Ukrainians have overperformed by every possible measure. The Europeans have stepped up to the plate in a way that I didn't think they were capable of. The Americans have joined in, and I thought with European feckleness and general disinterest from Obama and Trump and Biden that we wouldn't get involved. And then, of course, most of all, the Russians have just proven to plumb the depths and the frontiers of incompetence in every possible military field. It took that combination of things for Ukraine to still be in the game. I hope it continues, but this is still Russia's war to lose.
And what about a negotiated settlement? What does that look like? It seems like there could have been something, Donbass region, take that kind of earlier.
There have been 8.
Yeah. 8 opportunities?
Well, there have been 8 negotiated settlements with the Russians, and they just wait a few months to a year or two, and then they push on. It gives the Russians time to consolidate and move on. Remember that when the Soviet system existed, they controlled every one of the access points to the Eurasian plain where the Russian heartlands are. It was the most secure that the Russians had ever been. They'd spent 350 years building that exterior position, and they finally got it in 1940. 1992, they lost all but one of those access points. And everything that Moscow has done, not just Putin, everything that Moscow has done since 1992 has been about rebuilding that crustal defense. So this is the Karabakh War settlements. This is the Georgia War, the Abkhaz War, the Kazakh intervention, the Donbass War, the Crimea War. All of these are part of the same chapter of Russian history. And so if there was a negotiated settlement, they would grab the territory, they would reinforce it, they would consolidate it, and then as soon as they felt they were ready, they would launch another conflict, just like they did the last 8 times.
This one seems to be a little different for them.
Yes, they thought that they could get Ukraine all in one go, and they thought to a degree, like I did back in January, that the Europeans and the Americans were not going to stick up for Ukraine. And I, just like they, miscalculated.
Interesting. Well, maybe, I wonder if you don't miscalculate much, but maybe it's because we needed another war. We're out of Iraq, we're out of Afghanistan. What are we going to do? We have a lot of defense industry.
I don't know anyone in the army who's like, oh yeah, let's go back to war.
Oh, no, not the army. I'm talking more the politicians. And I wonder if we were still in Iraq and Afghanistan in those same numbers, would our support for Ukraine look different if we were still?
Oh yeah.
That's what I mean.
We were dependent upon the Russians to supply our forces in Afghanistan. So, I mean, we would have had a risk of having our entire military force in Afghanistan gutted.
Well, because we were coming through the stands, we're coming through K2.
Yeah.
Interesting. That's wild. Yeah, I think it would look different. I'm curious what it would look like if we were at the height of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We have some examples of that, a couple of different examples of the incursions that you just talked about with Russia when we were in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they were barely even a blip on our radar, it seemed like, anyway. Certainly not front page for more than a day.
Yeah, I mean, if there was a time to stop the Russians from this process and try to force them into negotiations over a non-Soviet future in which we all, get along, if that's the right phrase, the time was 2004, because that was when the Russians invaded Georgia. And Georgia was a country that was attempting to Westernize, attempting to get rid of corruption, attempting to join the EU. And because we were involved in Iraq, we had absolutely no diplomatic and especially military bandwidth. So the Russians invaded Georgia while Putin was in a box at the Olympics with George Bush to underline that there was nothing that he could do.
Wow. And I didn't know that he was at the Olympics. That's amazing. But yeah, it seems like we're distracted elsewhere. We pay very little attention to some of these other things going on that people can't really find. Especially
we have something we haven't had in the United States now in 20 years. We have dry powder.
Yeah, exactly. Got to use it. See, that's what I mean.
The point of dry powder is not to use it. The point of dry powder is you have the,
because you got to replenish it. You got to replenish it.
Yeah, I mean, it's been 4 years now since we did the withdrawal from Iraq. And so we now have an army that is rested and recouped and has had a chance to retrain and re-equip and build out its numbers again. It's capable. I don't think anybody in the military doubts that. But political support in the United States for any sort of ground war, that's going to take another decade. And that's not going to be in Ukraine.
No, I bet.
Unless something significant shifts in the strategic picture. So if Ukraine collapses this year, we will have forces in Poland, and we will be at a very high risk of a nuclear exchange with the Russians. That's one of the reasons why we're trying so hard to support the Ukrainians so that that doesn't happen, that we aren't put into that position.
Because there's no buffer anymore. Buffer states. Right.
And we now know that the Russians are so militarily incompetent that in a face-to-face fight with NATO, they would be obliterated. And so the only tool that they would have are nukes. And the Russians feel rightly that if they can't get to that crustal defense again, their demographic decline is so steep that they'll cease to exist in 20 years. And they're right. Mm-hmm. So for the Russians, they're all in, and that means every tool is on the table.
Yeah, man, wild. Shifting gears, I want to ask you what your thoughts are on the AI side of the house, artificial intelligence and quantum computing and ChatGPT and all that stuff that has been in the news recently. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, it's coming. It's been coming. We foresaw it in all sorts of science fiction novels and movies. So, what do you think? What's going on with ChatGPT?
Let me give you three things here. So, first of all, there are two types of AI. You've got applied AI, which is what we use in, say, automation and programming, where you have a very complex decision tree. And if anything falls out of that decision tree, the whole thing falls apart. So that's a programming issue. That's applied mechanics, applied intelligence, if you want to call it that. But it's really more accurately thought of as machine learning. Okay. And it requires a lot of people.